Have you ever believed that out here on the frontier, a man's fate could be rewritten in the space of just a few breaths? A cry short, cut off in the middle, hung in the brittle air. A shadow pressed against rock, a knife catching the last light of day. What you heard was not the wind, not an animal's cry, but the ragged breath of someone cornered, hunted to the end of her strength. And in that exact moment, Jonas Calder stepped out of silence. Before I carry you deeper into what happened, let me pause for a heartbeat. If these opening words already make your chest tighten, if they remind you of a time when you saw something wrong and knew you could not turn your back, tap the like button to help keep these Western stories alive. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from, maybe a wide porch out in the country, or a quiet little room in town. I promise you this, if you stay until the end, you'll understand why a man cut 5 times by a knife refused to let an Apache woman die alone in the dust. Jonas Calder had lived with the silence of high country for years. At 41, he wasn't a reckless boy anymore. Loss and long winters had shaped him into a man who kept to himself, trading pelts, setting his traps, returning each night to a cabin few men even knew existed. He wasn't chasing trouble that day. His only thought was to clear the last of his trap line before snow came down hard. But then, he heard it. Not a gunshot, not the wild scream of coyotes, just a woman's breath torn short, clipped by fear. Jonas reined in his horse, listening. He knew at once it wasn't an accident. It was terror. And terror like that in these lands rarely ended well. He tied off his pack mule beneath a cedar and moved down the slope, heavy frame but light steps, like a man long used to hunting without being seen. Through brush and brittle grass, he crept until the scene opened before him in the dry wash. 3 rough settlers had a young Apache woman trapped against the rocks. One held a rope, another gripped a knife. The third leaned on a rifle, guarding like he owned the ground. The woman, he would later learn her name was Nayeli, stood barefoot, hair in tangles, lips swollen. Her dress had been ripped down to the shoulder, and she was pressed back so hard against the stone it seemed she was trying to disappear into it. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. Her eyes had gone hard, because she knew tears would only feed the wolves. Jonas had seen this before, and once, years ago, he had turned away. Not this time. No warning. No words. The rifle cracked once. The man with the rope folded to the ground before he ever knew he was dead. The others spun, surprised, savage instinct waking in their eyes. The one with the knife rushed in. Jonas met him head-on, swinging the rifle stock like a hammer. Bone broke with a sound sharp as dry pine splitting. But the last one, the guard with the rifle, moved faster than Jonas expected. He lunged with a blade, slashing deep across Jonas's ribs. Heat and pain exploded under his coat. Jonas staggered but pivoted hard, slamming the butt of his rifle into the man's skull. Blood ran down into the man's eyes, but he still managed to drive his knife again, this time tearing across Jonas's back. The fight was close, brutal, every second a choice between standing and falling. Jonas struck again, putting the man on his knees. But before collapsing, the outlaw landed one more thrust, burying steel under Jonas's ribs, then turned and bolted up the wash, running like the devil himself had loosed a shot after him. Jonas dropped to one knee, vision narrowing. Blood soaked through his shirt, running warm down his side and back. 5 knife cuts, more than most men could survive. His breath came ragged, teeth clenched against the fire burning through him. For a moment, he thought it plain if the bleeding didn't stop, he'd never leave this dry creek alive. Then he felt at a hand, small, but steady, pressing hard against his wound. Nayeli. She hadn't run. She hadn't hidden. Dirt streaked her face, her dress torn near to shreds, but her eyes locked on his, sharp with the will to keep him breathing. She pushed her shoulder under his arm, bracing his weight, refusing to let him fall. Through the ringing in his ears, through the black, pressing at the edge of his sight. Jonas Calder realized one thing, with a clarity sharper than pain. He had given his blood for her, and now she was giving her strength back to him. Whatever path lay beyond that moment, it would no longer be his alone. Picture this: a man cut down by 5 knife wounds, blood soaking through every inch of his shirt, his breath slipping away like the last flicker of a fire. And beside him, not a comrade, not kin, but a young Apache woman who had only just escaped the claws of the men who meant to take her. Most in her place would have fled into the dark to save themselves. But Nayeli did not. She wedged her slender but determined arm under Jonas's shoulder and lifted, straining against his dead weight. Each step dragged, unsteady, yet driven by pure will. Every time Jonas buckled, she pulled harder, staggering forward a few more paces. No complaint, no words, just the sound of her ragged breathing and the red trail they left shining in the failing light. Her mind clung to a single goal, the ruined adobe shelter she had hidden in the night before. It wasn't safe, half its walls had crumbled. The roof gaped open to wind. The floor was nothing but cold dirt. But it was cover. It was the only shelter she knew nearby. The only chance to put him down somewhere not under the open sky. The way there was merciless. Jonas grew heavier with every moment, like a log gone waterlogged. Each breath was a harsh rasp. Each stumble spilled new blood from wounds that had no chance to close. Nayeli's hand slipped on his coat, slick with crimson, but she never let go. In her eyes there was no other choice but forward. When he collapsed fully, limp, she didn't panic. She pressed her ear to his chest, listening. The heartbeat was faint, but present. That was enough. With blood smeared up her arms, her back burning from the strain. She dragged him again inch by inch, grit tearing her palms raw. It wasn't muscle carrying him now. It was resolve, the certainty that she could not abandon the man who had bled for her. By the time darkness swallowed the land, she had hauled Jonas into the adobe shell. Her body ached, hands split open from the pull, but her eyes still carried a hard light. She laid him on a ragged bedding, tugged off his coat, then took the knife she had lifted from one of the dead men. With it, she slit his shirt open. 5 wounds, 5 raw openings, bright red and cruel. There was no liquor, no medicine, no surgeon's tools, only a clay jug of water, scraps of cloth, and memory fragments of what she had seen among her people when men came back hurt. She poured water across the cuts, rinsing dirt and blood. Her hands didn't shake once she began, though her lips pressed tight to hold down fear. Water spilled dark onto the floor, mud and blood mixing. She tore strips from her own dress, binding his side, shoulder, and back. Each time she pulled the cloth tight, Jonas groaned, breath-catching, his face twisting in pain. Nayeli froze a heartbeat, eyes soft with pity, then forced herself to pull harder. To hesitate now was to let him die. Worry pressed against her chest like a weight, but reason drove her hands on. When the wounds were bound, she slumped against the cracked wall. Jonas lay pale, his breathing shallow, a man balanced on the edge of death. Her blood-streaked hand stayed pressed to his chest, rising and falling in rhythm with his breaths. Outside, the coyotes cried across the plain, the wind sweeping hard over the grass. The shelter rattled under the cold, each draft sliding through its broken roof. It wasn't much more than rubble, but tonight, it was a fortress. The only line between him and the grave. Nayeli did not close her eyes all night. The burden of worry sat heavy, but she forced herself to stay alert, like a sentry on duty. Each time Jonas shifted or moaned, she leaned close, checked the bandages, pressed her palm to stop fresh bleeding. Each sound beyond the doorway sent her hand to the knife at her side. Questions circled in her mind. Who was this man? Why had he risked everything for a stranger? An Apache woman, so many whites would see as nothing but spoil. Was he like the others, or something different? She had no answers. Only the plain truth he had spent his blood for her, and his life now lay entirely in her keeping. His breath wavered through the hours, sometimes quick, sometimes nearly gone. Each falter made her heart clench until she could hear nothing but the rush of her own blood in her ears. She bent close, listening, brushing sweat from his brow, moistening his lips with drops of water. Her eyes, usually sharp and guarded, now burned with silent worry, not the loud panic of the inexperienced, but the deep, smothering fear of someone who knew what it meant to lose. When dawn at last crept through the broken roof, Jonas still lived, barely, but he lived. His chest lifted and fell, fragile but steady. The fire she had coaxed from scraps of wood had burned to embers, its warmth nearly gone. Her body ached, her hands cut and raw, yet her eyes didn't close. And then, in a whisper soft as prayer, in her own tongue, she spoke to him, though he could not hear. You saved me. Now I will not leave you. On the frontier, there were nights so silent you could hear your own heartbeat, but silence never truly meant peace. Inside the broken adobe shelter, Nayeli sat beside Jonas Calder, her eyes fixed on the blood-soaked bandages. Each breath from him came ragged, torn into pieces. She knew one small change could end it for good. Outside, the wind scraped dry branches against each other, making the sound of something lurking. Nayeli's grip tightened on the knife, her gaze fixed on the half-open doorway. It wasn't wolves she feared, it was men. One of the attackers had escaped, and if he lived, he would surely return with others. Near midnight, when the fire had burned down to faint embers, she heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, not coyotes, not deer, human. Her heart beat harder, her hand clamped down on the knife handle. A shadow crossed the opening. It was a woman, tall, sharp-featured, her long hair braided into a single rope. Her eyes, cold and cutting, swept the shelter the wounded man, the blood on the ground. The girl crouched at his side. This was Lena, a survivor known for being calm, calculating, and hard as stone. Behind her stood a smaller figure, shoulders hunched in a loose calico dress, arms wrapped tight around herself. Her wide eyes glimmered with fear. That was Mira, the youngest, fragile and trembling. Lena's gaze went to Nayeli, not with greeting, but with suspicion. Her voice was low and steady. You dragged him here. Nayeli nodded, her throat dry. He stopped them. Lena's eyes slid to Jonas, pale, breathing shallow, bandages dark with blood. Her expression shifted, not to pity, but calculation. Was this man a savior, or a burden? Mira whispered, voice thin as smoke. He will die. He still breathes, Nayeli answered firmly, though her words sounded more like she was convincing herself than the others. The air thickened with mistrust. None of them could ignore the truth. A white stranger bleeding in their midst was no ordinary thing. They had lived too long with betrayal, too long with promises turned into chains. Lena's eyes lingered on Nayeli, testing her resolve. One got away, Lena said slowly. If he reaches others, they'll come back. It won't take long. Nayeli knew. She had thought of that from the first moment Jonas fell. Every breath he drew now was stolen time. But still, her choice was made. His life mattered more than fear. Mira clutched the torn fabric closer around her shoulders, staring out into the dark. If they come, what do we do? Lena gave no answer right away. Her sharp gaze flicked back to Jonas. He was a living wound, a risk, and yet possibly their only shield. She wasn't ready to decide. Jonas groaned, caught in fevered dreams, his body jerking once. All three turned at once. The bandage had soaked through again. Nayeli pressed her hands firmly on the wound, her face tight with worry as she watched his shallow breathing. For a moment, Lena saw it clearly. Nayeli's resolve wasn't chance. There was something deeper, a refusal to let him go. That troubled her more than the wounds. Trust was dangerous, and danger killed quicker than cold. No one slept that night. The small fire flickered against the cracked adobe walls, throwing their shadows long and uncertain. The room thickened with unease. Would the escaped man return with help? Would Jonas live until morning? And if he did, what then? Ally or threat? Mira huddled near the door, eyes wide. Lena sat by the fire, arms folded, watching Jonas with the sharp patience of a predator. Nayeli stayed closest, her hand never leaving his chest, counting every breath as though her own life hung on it. By dawn, the shelter still stood. The danger had not come yet, but the weight of it pressed heavier than the cold wind outside. 3 women and 1 dying man, bound together by blood, mistrust, and the uneasy hope that morning might bring more than just survival. At first light, when the gray dawn slipped through the cracks of the adobe roof, Jonas Calder drifted awake. His body felt as though it had been laid across hot coals, every breath cut sharp through his ribs. Yet what struck him wasn't the pain. It was the sight before him. The 3 women were still there. They hadn't run. They hadn't taken his rifle, his knife, or the coins in his kit. Even his mule and horse, tied somewhere out in the dark, had not been led away. What he saw instead were Lena's watchful eyes, Nayeli's steady hands keeping his bandages tight, and Mira's nervous stare lingering on him like a child afraid of shadows. And in that moment, Jonas understood if they had meant to abandon him, he would already be a corpse in the cold. His voice rasped, rough as stone. "You didn't strip me. You didn't leave me." Why, silence answered him. Lena's sharp gaze gave nothing away. Mira lowered her head. Only Nayeli kept working the bandages. Jaw clenched, hands firm against the seep of blood. Jonas knew better than to press them. Instead, he spoke slowly, each word weighted with breath that cost him pain. "We can't last here. The one who ran will bring others. You know it." Lena inclined her head, but offered no reply. "I've got a place," Jonas said, forcing steadiness into his voice. "North Valley. A cabin. Roof still holds. Storeroom stocked. If we go together, we can see winter through." The words landed heavy. Mira looked up, startled, half disbelieving. Lena's eyes narrowed, weighing him. Nayeli met his gaze, searching for truth in his face. Jonas pressed on. "Help me stand. Help me walk. And I'll lead you there. Under my roof, no one touches you. No soldiers. No hunters. I've lost too much already. I won't leave anyone behind again." The air grew taut, the fire snapping in the silence. Outside, the wind slid over the grass like a blade. The 3 women shared glances, unspoken words passing between them. Alone, none of them would live long. But to stake survival on a stranger, on a white man, was a gamble sharp as any knife. Finally, Lena broke the stillness. "What if your cabin's a trap?" Jonas met her eyes, his own lined with fatigue but clear. "Then I'd have left your friend to die in the wash yesterday." "Short, but it carried the weight of truth," Mira whispered, uncertain. "Can we trust him?" Nayeli tightened the cloth around his chest, then nodded. If he meant harm, he'd have done it already. Lena's lips pressed thin. Then she exhaled through her nose. "Fine, but we can't carry you. You'll walk on your own feet." Jonas's mouth bent into a wry line, more grimace than smile. "I'll manage enough for that." In that moment, a cord bound them together. Not trust, not yet, but a fragile link forged by necessity. They all knew without working as one. They wouldn't last a day before trouble found them. Nayeli began packing what little remained. Lena stepped outside to scan the ground for tracks. Mira moved quietly, gathering cloth and dousing the fire. Each, in her way, took on a share of the weight. Jonas watched, something tightening inside his chest that wasn't pain. It had been years since he had seen the shape of a group around him. Not family, not friends, but lives tied together by survival. As the sun rose over the ridge, flooding the shelter with thin gold light, Jonas braced himself upright. Sweat broke across his face, but his eyes stayed sharp. His voice came low, steady as a promise. We go together. If one falls, the rest lift them. If riders come, we fight. No one gets left behind. Nayeli pulled the strap of her satchel tight. Lena gave the barest nod. Mira swallowed, clutching a ragged shawl to her shoulders. They weren't a family, not yet. But in the cracked shell of an adobe ruin, a fragile alliance took root born of spilled blood, cautious belief, and the will to outlast the winter waiting just ahead. On that first morning, they left the broken adobe shelter. The sky hung low and heavy like a damp blanket. No one spoke much. They didn't have to. Each of them understood that every step now was like placing their foot on a taut wire stretched between life and death. Lena went first. She moved with the confidence of someone who had survived too many ambushes to ignore the smallest sign. Her eyes swept over crushed grass, faint boot marks, the drift of the wind that might carry a stranger's scent. She read the land the way others read words, behind her. Nayeli supported Jonas Calder. Each time his weight sagged or his knees buckled, she bore it across her shoulders, straining but steady. Sweat soaked through her dress, and her hand pressed firm against the bandage at his side where fresh blood seeped through. Jonas made no complaint, though every breath seemed carved with pain. Without Nayeli's strength, he would already have fallen. Mira came last, burdened with a bundle tied tight water skin. Strips of cloth. What little food remained. Her thin arms trembled under the load, but she forced herself forward. Each rush of wind through the brush made her glance back with wide eyes, as if expecting horsemen to burst from the shadows. Together they moved as a small caravan, silent but bound, careful not to give the world more noise than the sound of their own breathing. When they reached the dry wash where Jonas had fallen the day before, all three women stopped at once. The place reeked of old blood. Dark stains striped the stones, a trail any hunter could follow straight to them. Jonas braced a hand against a cedar trunk, his voice raw. It has to be cleared, every mark, or they'll come straight to the cabin. Lena dropped to one knee, dragging a branch across the ground to scatter the prints. Nayeli tore a strip from the hem of her dress, soaked it in water, and scrubbed the rocks clean. Mira, though her hands shook, scattered cold ash over the darker patches of earth. No one complained. No one asked how long it would take. Their only thought was to make the ground look as though no fight had ever been fought there, no blood ever spilled. A crow cried above, startling Mira. She flinched, dropping the ash, eyes wide with panic. Jonas steadied himself, laid a rough hand on her shoulder. "Easy," he said, voice low but firm. "We still have time. Don't let fear walk in your steps." But his own gaze swept the horizon, wary. He knew too well how quickly men could follow the scent of blood. When at last the signs were hidden, they pressed on toward the spot where the animals had been tied. By some grace, both horse and mule still stood waiting, restless but unharmed. The horse snorted and pawed the ground. The mule tugged at its rope, but they had not broken free. Lena checked the ropes, scanning the brush. "Tracks," she whispered. "But old. No one has come back." Nayeli eased Jonas onto a flat stone while she and Mira loaded the mule with supplies. The water skin, the bandages, the rifle Jonas still claimed. It wasn't much, but it was enough to carry hope. Jonas raised his head, eyes hard and clear despite the blood loss. Listen, from here on, we move like one body. The lead keeps watch. The middle holds the pace. The last guards the trail. Every step has to count. No one argued. Their nods were quiet, but firm. They set out again in that order. Lena ahead, sharp and steady. Nayeli close against Jonas, her shoulder bracing his weight. Mira following, eyes cast back to check their tracks. Every sound, the crack of a branch. The tumble of a stone tightened their chests. At each noise, Lena lifted her hand for silence, and the group froze until the world settled again. Time stretched, every yard of ground doubled by caution. But it was that caution that gave them a chance. One careless step, one forgotten stain of blood, and their path to safety would have ended under gun barrels. By midday, pale sunlight broke weakly through the clouds. They had put the wash behind them. No one knew what waited ahead, but at least the ground behind no longer carried the trail of yesterday's fight. The soil bore only the faint gray of winter grass, as if nothing had happened there at all. And in that silence, the four of them learned a new rhythm, not trust, not yet, but the first uneasy shape of survival together. The wind carried the scent of snow by the time the four of them finally reached the hidden valley Jonas had promised. The cabin stood behind a line of rock, its dark timbers weathered but solid. No smoke had risen from its chimney in weeks, maybe months, but the roof still held. The shutters were drawn tight, and the stack of split wood leaned against the wall like a quiet assurance this place had once been lived in. Jonas staggered as he crossed the threshold. He tried to stand straight, but the weight of his wounds bent him low. Nayeli guided him to a wooden chair by the hearth. The cabin air was still, layered with dust and the chill of long neglect. Mira and Lena moved quickly, setting a fire, coaxing the first sparks into life. Jonas looked around, his breath rough and slow. His eyes caught on a small wooden box in the corner, a thin ring worn by time, a bundle of pelts rolled against the wall, relics of a life he had buried. He knew the women were watching him. They had stayed by his side, but caution still hung heavy. They needed a reason to believe him. Jonas understood if he left silence in its place, doubt would take root forever. The firelight flickered over the scars of his face and the weary set of his jaw. At last. He nodded slightly and spoke, voice gravel rough yet clear. "You want to know why I didn't walk away at the wash? Why I fired? Why I bled 5 cuts instead of leaving?" The room went quiet, but for the crack of wood in the fire. Nayeli sat close, eyes locked on him. Lena leaned forward on her knees. Mira huddled in a blanket, anxious but listening. Jonas fixed his gaze on the flames. "I had a family once. My wife was half Apache, half Mexican. We had a boy. He was 2 when the winter fever came. In a week, both were gone. I buried them east of the San Juan Range, under 2 small wooden crosses." His voice caught, but he pressed on. "Before that, I rode with the New Mexico volunteers. We pushed Apache bands off their land. I told myself it was the right thing. But every time I saw the faces of those we drove away, I knew I was standing on the wrong side. I let injustice pass before my eyes. Then fever took my family, and I understood the cost of silence." The words fell heavy into the fire-lit air. His hands shook slightly where they rested on his knees, but he did not look away. Lena's sharp eyes softened. Nayeli's hand clenched tight on her lap, holding back a tide of feeling. Mira turned her face aside, blinking fast, swallowing hard. Jonas lifted his head, meeting each of them in turn. "I swore I'd never stand by again. Yesterday, when I saw her pressed against that rock, his chin dipped toward Nayeli, I knew if I turned my back, I'd be that man all over again. And I won't live with that twice. No poetry, no grand gesture. Just truth spoken raw." Nayeli finally answered, her voice low but steady. "You lost everything. Yet you still rose to defend a stranger." Jonas drew a long breath and gave a weary nod. Stranger or not, she's human, and no human deserves to be hunted like game. The line struck deep. Lena's gaze lifted, a flash of recognition in her eyes. Mira straightened, still timid but less afraid. In that silence, something shifted. Not pity, something stronger. They had all been broken, left behind, chased from what was theirs. And now a man, scarred by blade and grief, had spoken aloud a vow they each longed for. No one would be abandoned again. Jonas leaned back, exhausted but fierce. "This cabin once held only me. But if you choose to stay, then no one breaches these walls. It won't be perfect, but it'll be a roof we stand under together." The fire's glow warmed the small room. The weight of suspicion loosened into something fragile but real. Nayeli dipped her head in quiet agreement. Lena gave a short, measured nod. Mira hesitated, then whispered, "I want to stay." And so, through confession born of pain, Jonas gave them more than wood and walls. He gave them the beginning of something rarer than safety on the frontier, the belief that none of them had to face the storm alone. The next morning, pale light broke over the eastern ridge, and the four of them were already prepared. The wind carried a sharper bite, the kind that warned winter was no longer far. Jonas, though every movement sent fire along his ribs, insisted on returning to the dry wash where blood had been spilled. "If we leave the bodies and the marks," he said, voice strained but steady, "it won't be long before the vultures or worse find us. We need to put them in the ground and let the earth hold this truth." Nayeli steadied him as they descended the slope, her shoulder firm under his weight. Lena took point, eyes sweeping for danger. Mira followed with a blanket wrapped around her thin frame, carrying a shovel and a pouch of ash taken from the cabin hearth. No words passed between them. Yet they all understood to clear the past was the only way forward. The wash lay silent, eerie in the morning chill. The two dead men still lay where they'd fallen, stiff and staring blankly at the sky. A sour smell drifted in the air, making Mira flinch and cover her mouth. Jonas stood still, his face carved with grim lines. These were men who had meant them harm. But even so, leaving them to rot would invite wolves and riders alike. Lena broke the silence first. She drove the shovel into the frozen ground, the dull thud echoing like a drumbeat. The earth was hard, stubborn with frost, but each strike was a step toward erasing the violence. Nayeli and Mira gathered stones and brush to cover the shallow graves. Jonas, weak as he was, knelt to drag the bodies down into the holes. Sweat beaded across his forehead, but he did not falter. Layer after layer of dirt and branches swallowed the shapes until nothing remained but two uneven mounds. The wind moved through the wash, carrying away the last trace of sound. Only then did Lena speak, her voice low, almost reverent. "It's done. No one will find them now." Jonas nodded, his breath ragged, but his eyes calmer than they'd been since the fight. To him, burying them was more than concealment. It was closure. Next they turned to the stones where Jonas had bled. The stains still marked the rock, vivid reminders of how close death had come. Nayeli rinsed the stone with water. Mira sprinkled ash, and Lena dragged brush across the ground until the wash looked like any other stretch of barren creek bed. When they were finished, the earth bore no memory of what had passed. By the time they returned to the cabin, their steps carried less weight. The fear of tracks behind them had lifted. It felt as if a heavy door had been closed on the nightmare of the night before. The wind was colder, yes, But in their hearts there was a warmth they had erased the signs that tied them to the bloodshed. Inside. Jonas eased himself back into the chair by the fire. His voice was tired, but certain. "We'll need 3 weeks' wood. Water stored. Food dried and salted. Once the storm comes, none of us will get far." Lena took the axe outside, each strike against the wood ringing sharp and steady. Mira sorted the food stores, counting the beans, folding the strips of smoked meat, measuring the salt with careful fingers. Nayeli stoked the fire, boiled water, and washed the cloths clean for fresh bandages. The cabin filled with sounds of purpose, the crackle of fire, the rhythm of the axe, the sigh of the winter wind pressing against the shutters. Not chaos, not fear, but the cadence of work of life. Each of them had a role now, and the cabin, once only Jonas's refuge, began to feel like a shared home. When Lena brought in a heavy armful of wood, Mira looked up at her and smiled faintly, the first true smile in many days. Nayeli laid a hand gently on Jonas's shoulder and whispered, "You kept your word. We have a place to stand." His answering look was quiet, but in it shone something brighter than pain, the glow of a man who had chosen not just to survive, but to protect. That night, snow drifted soft against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned warm. A pot of thin stew gave off its humble scent, and the breath of 4 souls rose and fell together. Beyond the shuttered windows, winter pressed closer, but for the first time since their paths had crossed, they felt not hunted, not alone, just alive, bound by the fragile but growing certainty that they could weather the storm as one. Hope had found a place among them, and it settled in the cabin's wooden walls like a promise. Snow kept falling for 3 straight days, thick as a white curtain draped over the valley. The cabin, once nothing more than Jonas Calder's lonely shelter, now stood like a small fortress, a haven where 4 souls warmed themselves by the fire. Each morning, Lena rose early to split wood, her steady axe blows ringing with the sound of survival. Mira helped Nayeli wash rice, dry beans, wrap strips of smoked meat in cloth. Jonas, though still weak from his wounds, refused to remain idle. He mended saddles, sharpened blades, and showed Lena how to reload quickly should danger ever return. As the days passed, the sharp edge of suspicion dulled. Distrust gave way to a quiet rhythm, and fear softened into the comfort of shared work. The cabin no longer felt like a hideout, it became a home. One night, with the blizzard howling outside and the fire snapping bright within, Jonas leaned back against the wall, his voice low but firm. "Listen to me," he said. "From this day forward, under this roof, no one lays a hand on you. Any man who comes here with malice will pay dearly. I swore never to stand idle before injustice again, and I'll keep that vow. It wasn't a grand declaration, just plain words spoken from the heart." Yet in that small room, they struck like the crack of a rifle. Lena, usually the hardest to move, gave a short nod. Mira glanced nervously at Jonas, then at Nayeli, as if searching for reassurance. Nayeli did not answer at once. She simply held Jonas's gaze, her dark eyes shining with firelight. Then she stood, walked to the beam that crossed the ceiling, and took the knife Jonas had given her. Without another word, she began carving. 3 small marks cut deep into the wood, simple, but weighted with meaning. "This is the sign," she said softly. "From this night, this place belongs to us all." Lena and Mira came forward. Each laid her hand upon the marks, silent agreement in the gesture. Jonas watched, his chest tightening. For years, this cabin had been nothing but a place to survive. Now it was more a shared home, claimed not with deeds of law, but with blood, trust, and choice. Peace settled over the room. The wind shrieked outside, but it felt distant now. In the glow of the fire, they were no longer strangers bound by necessity. They were something new, something closer to a family. The winter days that followed took on the steady shape of life. Lena taught Mira how to read animal tracks in the snow. Mira, in turn, learned to cook simple meals and sew patches into worn garments. Nayeli tended Jonas's wounds, but also listened as he spoke of his wandering past tales of battles fought, mistakes made, and lessons learned. For the women, his stories were both warnings and gifts. One evening, as they sat around their rough-hewn table, Jonas looked at them, three faces illuminated by lamplight, and said, slowly, "I once believed my life would end in silence. But tonight, hearing laughter inside these walls, I realize perhaps the Lord hasn't left me after all." Mira giggled. Lena looked down to hide the flicker of emotion in her eyes, and Nayeli simply laid her hand upon the table, resting it lightly near Jonas's own. She didn't pull away when their hands touched. And now, dear listener, perhaps you feel the same quiet change as they did. A man who had lost everything found reason to rise again. Three women who had known only flight and fear found a place to rest. Together, they built not a perfect life, but something far rarer, a home carved out of hardship. If you believe Jonas deserves this chance, I invite you to share your thoughts. Let us know where you're listening, from whether it's a quiet porch out in the countryside or a small room in a bustling city. Your words of support are like adding another log to this fire, keeping these frontier tales burning bright. That night, when the snow lay heavy on the roof, Jonas could not sleep. He sat by the small window, staring at the moon's pale light stretched across the white valley. In his heart rose a question: what comes next? He knew the cabin could not be their world forever. Spring would come, the passes would open, and beyond these walls the frontier remained as dangerous as ever. To truly protect them, Jonas would need to do more than keep a vow. He would need to think of a lasting future, a ranch rebuilt, a steadier life where Lena no longer had to scan every horizon, where Mira could grow like any ordinary girl, and where Nayeli might laugh freely without fear of being hunted. And so, dear friends, I turn the question to you. Should Jonas keep them safe within these walls, or should he lead them beyond, to raise something stronger, a true home, a life to endure after the snow melts? What would you have him do? Your thoughts may guide the next steps of this story. That winter, the cabin became more than shelter. It was a living declaration: here we stand, together, not as fugitives, not as strangers, but as a family of choice. Snow could fall, wolves could howl, even men could ride with rifles, but nothing could erase the truth carved into the beam above them. 3 marks, 3 women, and one man who had sworn, at last, never to leave another soul behind. By the fire, Jonas Calder sat in silence, a faint smile touching his scarred face. For the first time in years, he wasn't living only to survive. He was living for something worth protecting, something that gave him hope for tomorrow.